Well, hey, it's Rob. This is my fourth video about the Gibson Moderne, and I'm specifically talking about the one that Dan Erlewine had a hold of in the early 70s. I'm going to talk about the history of that guitar as far as who owned it, where I think it came from. I've been speaking to a few people, and maybe I've uncovered something that hasn't been revealed previously, but, take it with a grain of salt. It's just from conversations I'm having at the present time with people who I don't, know personally, but tell me they have some history with this guitar. Anyway, so I'll go from when Dan owned it forward, and then I'll back up a little bit. So Dan had this guitar. He didn't know what it was, bought it from a guy in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the early 70s. He thought it was an Explorer. Someone from George Gruhn's shop in Nashville happened to come by and saw it in this place called the Ann Arbor Music Mart, where Dan had sold it. He wanted to get rid of it. He didn't know what it was. He didn't like it. He said it looked crude. It had been altered, and the work that was done on it was very unprofessional. When this guy from George Gruhn's shop got it, he called George. Of course, George has the premier vintage guitar, store in Nashville, and still does to the present day. George said, "That sounds like a Gibson Moderne. Buy it." They took it back to Nashville. George looked at it, said, "This thing is a fake. It is very crudely made and clearly not original." George found a buyer, however, and that was somebody in Tokyo who took it over to Japan, where it hung in a store window for decades. It has now since vanished, and nobody knows the location of it. Now, my part of the story here is that I spoke to a couple of guys who say they know who sold the guitar to Dan Erlewine in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the early 1970s. It was a friend of theirs named Jack. Jack is still around, but he doesn't like to talk to people, so I'm hearing this from Jack's friends. But Jack's friends both say they did see this Gibson Moderne, or whatever, it happens to be, maybe a copy of a Gibson Moderne that was crudely put together. And, they verify that Jack owned this guitar in the early 1970s and that he sold it to Dan Erlewine at some point. And they know the history of this guitar from seeing it themselves and from what they heard from Jack. Now, Jack has a story which is not too reliable because it has two different versions. First version is that Jack got this guitar out of a dumpster at Gibson in Kalamazoo. Now, Kalamazoo's not far from Ann Arbor, maybe 100 miles, so, it's plausible. And that the guitar said factory second on it. It had a Gibson Moderne neck, but he didn't like the neck, so he took it back to Gibson and said, "Can you put a standard Gibson SG or Les Paul neck on it?" Which they did. After that point, he sold it to Dan Erlewine. Now, the second story, Jack says, is that he bought it off a guy named Ralph Cole. Ralph Cole is a guitarist for a band called Lighthouse, who are a Canadian band. Ralph Cole is known to play a late 50s Flying V, so it's not, again, out of the realm of possibility that he might have this guitar, this Gibson Moderne, to sell to this guy, Jack. Now, Ralph Cole, according to his cousin, worked at Gibson, so it's very possible he got this out of a dumpster, and that these two stories kind of got intermingled over the years, and then once it came from the dumpster, it was sold to this guy, Jack. It's also possible that Ralph Cole made this guitar. He worked at Gibson. Maybe he saw a Moderne, wanted a guitar like it, possibly got an original Gibson Moderne neck, built a body for it, sold it to this guy, Jack. Jack didn't like the Gibson Moderne neck, so he went and had the only original part of the Moderne replaced, and then they ended up with a fake body and a neck off a standard SG or a Les Paul. So those are the things I know. This picture you're looking at right here in the video is one that Jack's girlfriend or someone they knew drew, and it's clearly a Gibson Moderne that was drawn a long time ago. They say in the early 70s. They say somebody's girlfriend drew a picture of Jack's Moderne when he owned it. This is the only kind of verification I have, and of course, it could have been drawn last week, but again, you can consider this story yourself and see if it has any merit just based on the facts that I'm sharing.